and welcome to the York Festival of Ideas. My name is Dilnoza Duturaeva. I am a lecturer in medieval history at the University of York, and I will be chairing the event today. And it is my great pleasure to welcome you all. Now it is my great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Stephen Harrison. Stephen is a lecturer in ancient history at Swansea University. His research covers the period from the 6th to 2nd centuries BCE, the era of the Achaemenid Persian Empire, Alexander the Great, and the Hellenistic kingdoms. He explores the interactions between these empires with a particular focus on the relationship between Greece and the Near East, using kingship as a lens. More broadly, Stephen is interested in the representation of power and in interdisciplinary approaches to monarchy and empire. This evening, Stephen will speak to us about the lives and legacies of Alexander the Great. Stephen, over to you.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much, everyone. Sound all okay? Hear me at the back and all that kind of thing? Great, okay, fantastic. Thanks for a warm welcome. Thanks so much for coming to listen to me speak today. Let's go. All right, Alexander the Great, a genius, a tyrant, a dreamer, a killer, a visionary, a maniac, Greek, not Greek, gay, not gay, a god, not a god, paranoid, destructive, delusional, drunk, virtuous, chivalrous, magnanimous, titanic, divorced, beheaded, died. No, that's someone else, isn't it? That's somebody else. I open with those words about Alexander because I think they get to the heart of two things that are really, really important about Alexander and about studying Alexander. The first is it emphasizes just how polarized debate about Alexander is. People can look at the same evidence and reach fundamentally opposed conclusions. The second thing that those words drive at is that when people have studied Alexander, they have usually looked at Alexander as a person, as a human, and looked at his character. And the reason they've done that is because Alexander did something that very few people in human history have done. And so when we study Alexander, people have wanted to find out what it was that made him tick so that they can do it too. So I want to start by stressing that the aim of my talk tonight is not to teach you all how to conquer the entire known world. That's a kind of aim I couldn't read. So let's get into it. Alexander was born in 356 BCE, and the world he is born into is a world which is dominated by an imperial superpower, the Persian Empire. So Persia in the south of modern-day Iran had been a small power for much of the first millennium BCE until, under the rule of Cyrus the Great, the Persians conquered a huge empire. Starts with Asia Minor and Media and Babylon. Under Cambyses, they take control of Egypt. Darius I pushes the Persians into the Black Sea and into Thrace. And for 200 years, the Persians had dominated the Near East and the Aegean worlds. Of course, the Persians are most famous in the Western world because Xerxes, the Persian king, had led an invasion of the Greek mainland, which had been repulsed. But even after that, the Persians dominated the Near East. For most of that period, Macedonia had been essentially a second-rate power, a backwater. Macedonia is in the north of modern-day Greece. You can see there, Aegae on the map on the left-hand side there is the capital of Macedon. And Macedon really had been peripheral in Greek affairs. It pops up occasionally in sources like Herodotus and Thucydides, but never really kind of exerted much of an influence on the Greek world until Alexander's father, Philip II, comes to power. Philip comes to power in 359, and over the next 20 years, he transforms Macedonia. There are military, social, and economic reforms, and he leads military conquests which enable him to dominate the Greek world. The climax of this comes in 338 at the Battle of Chaeronea, when Philip had defeated an army of Greeks commanded or shared command by the Athenians and the Thebans. And that gave Philip control of the Greek world. So this is the kind of world that Alexander was growing up in. His father was becoming a more and more powerful figure. His country was becoming more and more recognized on the kind of regional scale. As we kind of get Alexander into his teens and as he's kind of approaching manhood, the sources start to give us a sense that there may have been a difficult or a tense relationship between Philip and Alexander. Lots of different reasons for this, but one of the key reasons is that Philip was polygamous. He had many different wives, multiple wives. First 6 wives he'd married had been from places around the edges of Macedonia. Essentially what Philip did was he won a war and then married a woman from the people who he had defeated, and this was a way of trying to build ties with that kingdom or that place. So it was a polygamous court. But then in the 330s, Philip married again for the 7th time. And this time he married a Macedonian woman, a woman called Cleopatra. And she had an uncle or a guardian who was called Attalus. And at a banquet, one night, everyone got hammered. This will be a theme. The Macedonians got hammered regularly and bad things happened as a result. But everyone gets drunk and Attalus stands up to propose a toast. And he says, I'd like to raise a toast to the king and to his new bride, a Macedonian bride, in the hope that we finally get a legitimate heir to the throne. And Alexander throws his cup at Attalus and says, well, do you think I'm a bastard then? What do you think of me? And Attalus laughs in his face. And then Alexander turns to Philip and sort of says, are you going to let him talk to me like that? And Philip gets up and he grabs his sword, he draws his sword, and he staggers forward. And he goes not towards Attalus, but towards his own son, Alexander, brandishing his sword. And then, just as he's about to strike Alexander, he's so drunk he falls down in a heap. And then Alexander crows over him and he says, there lies the man about to cross from Asia into Europe, cannot cross from one couch to another. And then Alexander goes off into exile. And it's only with significant kind of diplomatic work that this breach between Alexander and his father is repaired. Now, that's a really good story. I can tell it's a really good story because at least 2 people had a little giggle as I was telling that story. So it's a good story, but it's not true. Or at least, I don't think it's true. That story is written down in the life of Alexander that was written by a Greek historian during the Roman Empire, a guy called Plutarch. Plutarch is one of 5 ancient sources that survive about Alexander. The earliest literary account we have of Alexander's life was written down almost 300 years after he died. There is next to no material culture from Alexander's reign, save for some coins. There is almost no archaeological evidence at all. So imagine if, in 2,000 years' time, everything the world knew about Henry VIII was based on 5 books that were written tomorrow. That gives you a sense of the scale of the challenge we face when we try to explore or study Alexander. And so, for all this is about Alexander the Great and lives and legacies, and for all I'm going to tell you the story of Alexander, I want to stress something, which is almost everything that I say tonight has been debated. Every single thing I say to you, this is a fact. Somebody else would stand on this stage and dispute it. Yeah? So what we're going to do is we're going to go through Alexander's reign. I'm going to tell you the narrative and the stories of what happened. I can't tell you everything, because for all, there's only 5 sources. They did write down a lot of stuff. So I'm going to have to be selective and pick out things. But what I want to do is give you a flavor of what it's like to study Alexander now, and what it's like to study Alexander in the wake of the kind of social and intellectual changes that have happened in the last 20 years, 25 years or so. So I'm going to draw out 2 or 3 detailed examples which hopefully give you a sense of some of the themes that I think are important when we think about Alexander. So, Philip is killed in 336 BCE. He is going into a theatre to celebrate his daughter's wedding. One of his own bodyguard runs forward and stabs him to death, and then runs off, is grabbed and is hacked to pieces before he can be interrogated. Because that happened, some people think maybe Alexander was involved in a conspiracy. So Alexander comes to power in 336. moves very quickly to consolidate his control of Macedonia, and then in 334 BCE, he launches the campaign that makes him famous, which means that you know who he is and wanted to come and hear about him. So the thing that dominates Alexander's life is his conquest of the Persian Empire. He invades Persia in 334 and very quickly fights two battles against the Persians. The first is the Battle of the Granicus, which takes place just above Troy on the map there in the north of modern-day Turkey. That battle, the Persians are commanded by a group of governors of different parts of the empire. They're called satraps. The following year, in 333, Alexander does battle against the Persian king Darius III at a place called Issus in the south of modern-day Turkey. And when we talk about Alexander, I think it is the battles that have made him so fascinating to people for centuries. This is a representation called the Alexander Mosaic. It was found in the House of Faun in Pompeii, and it's now in the Archaeological Museum in Naples. And here you've got Alexander riding in from the left on his horse, Bucephalus. You've got Darius III in his chariot, his hand out, as though he can see the trouble coming from the direction of Alexander. And the pivotal moment in the Battle of Issus comes when Darius is forced to flee from the battlefield, having been personally attacked by Alexander. Now, what that image does is it focuses a battle between thousands and thousands of men on two individuals. Alexander and Darius stand out here, and the battle is encapsulated in the fight between the two of them. And that's what the ancient sources do more generally. The literary sources, they portray these battles as kind of Alexander's heroic leadership, and they focus on what he was doing and what Darius was doing. And in some sense, I think modern scholars have done the same thing. They've thought about Alexander's personal role in battle. And part of the things that I'm thinking about at the minute is I've written a book which came out on Monday, and it's my very first one. And this is my first one. It was my first time talking about it as well. And when I was writing the book, I think the thing that surprised me the most was how difficult I found it to write about the battles. And the reason for it, I think, is that ultimately I hate battle narratives. Battle narratives do strange things to historians. They make us forget how to write like real people. And so visions suddenly fleet. Spears glint and glisten in the sun. Shields clash and dreams are dashed. They're phrases we would never normally use, enlivened with gratuitous half-rhymes and needless alliterations. We hear war cries which are always fearsome. The pounding of the horse's hooves. Sometimes you get the screams mentioned and they're always piercing, or God forbid, blood-curdling. And so I had a real problem writing about battle narratives like this, because one of the things that historians are trying to do when they write like that is that they're trying to get you to imagine that you are part of this. They are trying to get you to imagine yourself on a horse, straining to keep up with Alexander as he charges, beads of sweat forming on your brow. They're drawing on your senses to draw you in, make you feel part of it, to get you to turn the page and keep reading. But should battle narratives be exciting? That was one question I raised when I was writing this book. Is that what we should be trying to do? Yes, the campaigns of Alexander are an awful long time ago, but when we glorify war in the ancient world, is there a danger that we are complicit in glorifying the notion of war itself? And when we're talking about Alexander, we're talking about a very particular kind of war, expansionist, unprovoked, imperialistic. So I think we need to be careful about battle narratives that are exciting. The other thing that frustrates me about battle narratives that focus on these individuals is that they are completely unrealistic as to how things worked in the ancient world. People tend to present generals like Alexander like chess masters, grand chess masters, pushing around these pieces on a board, always in control, always thinking through the next move, You know, it's the Jurgen Klopp, it's the Pep Guardiola, it's the tiki-taka moving these things around, outsmarting the other general. But what we've got to remember is that the Battle of Issus was fought on a beach and there were thousands of horses there. Alexander was on a horse surrounded by 15,000 horses. That's thrown up clouds and clouds of dust. Alexander can't control what's going on the other side of the battlefield because he cannot see. He can't see more than 15 yards. Yeah? So when we're kind of focusing on the individuals, I think we forget about the really important things that are happening on a battlefield, which in this case really is the experience and the equipment and the expertise of the Macedonian soldiers themselves. They had been under arms under Philip for the best part of 20 years. They're well trained, they're well motivated, they trust each other, they trust their leaders. So I think one of the things I've tried to do in the book is try to flesh out some of that. But I was also struck as I was writing, and I was trying to say, oh, well, you know, it's really important that the troops are well fed. The fate worse than inaccuracy is actually being boring. So in the book, I did find myself going back and being like, oh yeah, here comes, let's lop some arms off, you know? And I think hopefully if you read it, or if you hear me talk, if I come back to it later on, you might get a sense of irony from it a little bit, because sometimes this does matter. But these early battles against Darius opened the door to the south coast of Phoenicia and Egypt. So Alexander, there were some major sieges at Tyre and Gaza, and then Alexander gains control of Egypt. And what he's doing here is he's making sure that he secures his flank, and he's making sure he secures his communication line. The danger is, if Darius has fled the Battle of Issus, he's gone back towards Iran. Alexander could chase after him, but the danger if he does that is the Persians just get a load of people in ships from Tyre, sail up to Macedonia and take control of that. So he's wiping out the naval strength of the Persians in this period. Goes off to Egypt, builds a city, calls it Alexandria, that kind of thing. Right. The next key moment comes in 331 at the Battle of Gaugamela. So while Alexander's been in Egypt, Darius has been assembling a massive army, drawing on people from all over his empire. And for all, I've just done quite a lengthy bit about how individuals don't matter and generalship doesn't matter and leadership doesn't matter. When it comes to the Battle of Gaugamela, it actually does. Because Alexander arrives at Gaugamela in the north of modern-day Iraq. It's not that far from contemporary Mosul. Alexander gets to Gaugamela and he discovers that Darius' army massively outnumbers his. And Darius is chosen to fight on a wide open plain. And the danger of that kind of situation is that Alexander's army can be encircled because the Persians have more men than him, and that he can be surrounded and then attacked from all sides, and the Macedonians won't be able to escape. And so essentially what he realizes is, in order to have a chance of winning the battle, they're going to have to win quickly. The longer the battle goes on, the more the Persians can bring their weight of numbers to bear on the situation. And he decides that the best way to win the battle quickly is to attack Darius himself. If he can kill Darius or capture Darius or make Darius flee, he thinks Persian morale might collapse and they can win the battle. And so to do this, he adopts a stratagem, a military kind of tactic. Essentially what he does is, he goes off to the right-hand side of his army, I'm now Alexander, he goes off to the right-hand side of his army, he looks at the Persians, and he starts an attack. But instead of just starting a cavalry charge straight up at the people in front of him, what he does is he advances at an oblique line, diagonally. He goes off this way. Darius is in the middle of the Persian army. He sees Alexander moving, and so he orders his units to kind of follow Alexander. Don't engage, but just follow him. Make sure he doesn't encircle us. The problem is, in Darius' army, you've got units who are equipped in different ways, and that means they move with different speed. Yeah? So these guys are on horses, and they're going quick. They're going quick, but it's a bit slower from the people in the middle. Yeah? And so what starts to happen is a gap. This lecture theatre is perfect for this. A gap starts to open up between the Persian army. And as soon as the gap opens up, Alexander goes for it. Cavalry charge straight through the gap towards where Darius is sitting in the middle of the Persian army. Darius sees Alexander coming and again flees from the battlefield. And gradually, as news of this starts to filter around the battlefield and word of that gets out, the Persians start to be routed and to be defeated. It's really important to stress that Alexander's opening gambit didn't win the battle. It created the conditions to win the battle, but it was still an incredibly hard fight, and individual Macedonians were still standing in a line for hour after hour after hour, two hands on a sarissa, going like that, for hours and hours and hours and hours. So that's that balance I'm talking about between recognizing the leadership that Alexander offers as a military commander, but also recognizing the excellence of the people who he was commanding. Victory at Gaugamela opens the way for Alexander to seize control of the major cities of the Persian Empire. Babylon falls without a fight, the great kind of city of the ancient world. Susa, the old Elamite city, which has been a Persian royal capital, falls. And then Alexander gains control of Persepolis in the south of modern-day Iran, the capital, the emotional heartland of the Persian Empire. And when they gain control of Persepolis, I think we see, or we get a sense of, the dark side of military conquest, because the Macedonians run amok in the city. Men are killed indiscriminately, women and children are hauled off and enslaved. The sources don't make it explicit that sexual assault happened, but that will have been rife. The sources talk about how the destruction and the cruelty was so great that some Persians took their family up to the roofs of the houses, and threw themselves to their death to escape. Other people locked themselves up in the house and set themselves alight and burnt their houses down to escape the cruelty of the Macedonians, but also to make sure that their possessions didn't fall into the hands of the Macedonian soldiers. And the Macedonians were certainly looting in Persia. There's stories about how the Macedonians were so keen to get hold of this loot that they started to fight amongst themselves. Precious things were cut up so that individuals could each have a piece. Little hands were cut off in the fighting as people were greedily trying to grab things. In some cases, the Macedonian soldiers were killing each other to get a hold of the best material. And then eventually Alexander calls a halt to this. In some sense, I don't know, I think it's really important. I'm looking at people going, oh, that sounds grim. I think it's really important when we talk about Alexander, or we talk about any military conquest, that we talk about examples like that. I think it does justice to the people who experience it. I also don't think we should be surprised that that's what happened in Persepolis. The Macedonians had been brought up to think of the Persians as the archetypal evil villains of antiquity. They had been brought up in a world which dehumanized the Persians, and then, given the opportunity to exert their wrath, they did so. So we shouldn't be surprised by that. What's more surprising is what Alexander did in Persepolis. He stayed in the city for 3 or 4 months, systematically emptying the treasury of all of its gold and its silver and its jewelry, and taking the treasury to Susa and then to Babylon. And then after 3 or 4 months, he went up to, there's a terrace in Persepolis, 17 meters above the city, where the Persians had built a load of palaces and kind of royal buildings. Alexander went up there after 3 or 4 months, set fire to it, burnt it down, and then the next day left Persepolis. And what scholars have done for centuries, really, is argue about why he did that. So this is where we can think about the sources. So one of our sources is a guy called Arrian. Arrian was writing in the second century of the Common Era. He was a Greek, but he was working in the Roman imperial administration. And what Arrian says is that Alexander decided to set the Persian palaces on fire in order to avenge the Greeks for everything they'd suffered at the hands of the Persians. So according to Arrian, this was a deliberate decision which was motivated by revenge. Okay? Now, Arrian, for centuries, has been considered the most reliable of the ancient authors about Alexander. And the reason for that is that he says that one of his 2 principal sources is a guy called Ptolemy. So Ptolemy was one of Alexander's closest friends. He became one of his leading generals, and after Alexander's death, Ptolemy became the king of Egypt. He founded a dynasty which lasted until Cleopatra had an incident with a snake. If anyone knew what happened during Alexander's campaign, it's Ptolemy. So when Arrian tells us that this is why Alexander did things, if he's getting this information from Ptolemy, we should believe it, right? That's one option. But it's not the only story. The 3 or 4 other sources tell a much more detailed story. They talk about how there was a drunken banquet one night, and an Athenian woman called Thais stood up. And Thais, not only was she an Athenian woman, she was a courtesan, a high-class prostitute. And she stood up drunkenly and she said, "Lads, do you know what would be funny? Do you know what would be real hoot? Let's go and burn the palaces down. Wouldn't that be funny? Come on, think about all the things the Persians did to us. Wouldn't it be funny if we burnt their palaces down? And wouldn't it be great if I did it first? And then the whole world would know that Greek women have done worse to the Persians than Persian men ever did to Greece." And Alexander is caught up in the enthusiasm of this. He's swept along, and they call for torches, and they run out, and they start a fire, and then other Macedonians come and try to put the fire out, and they're like, lads, no, we're burning it down, come on, get involved. And so they burn the palace down. And then the next day, when the hangover wears off, they go, maybe we shouldn't have done that. So those sources are much more dramatic. They're much more critical of Alexander. And so scholars have quite often dismissed them. After all, Ptolemy seems to have said it was a deliberate decision, and it was all about revenge. But here we get to the problem, because after Alexander's death, Ptolemy had a sexual relationship with Thais, who had his children. If it's true that Alexander regretted this, Ptolemy had a very clear motive for suppressing the role of Thais. He doesn't want it out there that he's hanging around with a woman who is known to have led kings astray when he's trying to become a king himself. Okay, so Ptolemy's clearly telling a fib. It must be that they got drunk and burnt it down, and Ptolemy's covering it up, right? But hang on, that story about them getting drunk and burning it down, we don't know where that comes from. We can't trace that to an eyewitness. And this is why studying Alexander is frustrating, because there's no right answer. And this is where you guys, that's all the information you need now to come to your own opinion. You can choose your own Alexander there. You can decide which of those versions of events seems most plausible. And you've got just as much right to that opinion as I do. And I've been studying it for 20 years. And I think that gives you a sense of some of the challenges of studying Alexander. Hang on. The capture and the burning of Persepolis is a turning point. And shortly afterwards, Darius III is murdered in a palace coup that is led by a guy called Bessus. Bessus is the satrap, the governor of Bactria, ancient Afghanistan, and he withdraws into Bactria. Alexander chases him, and over the next couple of years, he gets embroiled in guerrilla warfare and finds out that it's actually very hard to conquer Afghanistan, which is a lesson that precisely nobody has learned. While that military action is happening, there's a little bit of a changing of the guard in the Macedonian court. So, first of all, we get tales of conspiracies against Alexander. The first one is allegedly led by a guy called Philotas, who is the commander of the Companion Cavalry, so a really important position. And more than that, his dad, Parmenion, is Alexander's number 2 in the army. They're accused of conspiracy and they are executed. And we start to see a shake-up in the Macedonian command as some of Alexander's closest friends, some of the people who are Alexander's age, start to replace the generation who are older than them, the kind of commanders of Philip's army that Alexander has inherited. So we see a couple of conspiracies. We also see a changing of the guard happen in different ways. So again, this is another story about people getting drunk. In Marakanda, modern-day Samarkand, they have a banquet. During the banquet, a guy called Clytus starts to criticize Alexander. He basically says, you're not that good a king. You're not that great. And Alexander says, yes, I am. And he says, no, you're not. And Alexander says, yes, I am, and I'll prove it to you. And he picks up a spear and he runs it through and kills him on the spot. There's different versions of that event, but the bottom line is Alexander got hammered and murdered one of his generals. And there's a change in tone in the court after that, as people start to realize that actually speaking freely in front of the king might have consequences. So we start to see changes like that. One of the root kind of causes for this tension that we're getting between Alexander and the Macedonian elite is the question of what to do with Persians and what to do with Persian culture. Alexander starts to wear Persian clothing, for instance. Part of this is to try to appeal to the Persians who he's defeating, to show them that actually he can be sympathetic to their culture and that he can rule in a manner to which they're accustomed. And the best example of this is a gesture called proskynesis. So proskynesis is depicted on this relief from Persepolis. The figure at the front is coming in front of the king and he bows before him and he blows him a kiss. Now, in Greece, in some contexts, that might be considered an act of worship or an act which had some kind of divine connotations. So some scholars have seen Alexander's attempt to introduce proskynesis to his court as an attempt to get his men to worship him as a god. That's one side of the debate. But in Persia, this gesture really was a gesture about court status. It was something that all Persians did when they came before the king, essentially as a way of acknowledging his royal status. So some scholars have looked at this and said, okay, well, he's adopting a Persian custom so that Persians can recognize his kingship and can show that he is the king, show they accept that he is the king, and he's encouraging Macedonians to do the same, to kind of equalize court protocol, to integrate Persians and Greeks and Macedonians. So again, absolutely the same evidence, completely polarized opinions. On one side, you can have Alexander as quite a reasonable figure, grappling with the challenges of ruling a multicultural empire. On the other hand, you can have a megalomaniac who wants to be worshipped as a living god. Scholars have argued for both of those positions. This is all running on as the guerrilla warfare is happening, and in order to kind of draw a line into this, what Alexander does is he adopts his father's strategy of finding a useful bride and a useful father-in-law. So in 327, he marries a woman called Roxanne, whose father-in-law is a local nobleman, and he's able to kind of secure the frontier for Alexander. And what that does is that lets Alexander go on into India. In India, he fights a battle against the Indian king Porus at the Hydaspes. He wins that battle. And then he reaches the river Hyphases when his men say, "We just want to go home, mate. Like, come on, we've conquered everything. Can we go home?" And he doesn't want to, but eventually he's persuaded. What I think is really interesting about India is we get these kind of, this is the high watermark of the romantic tradition, but also the dark side of Alexander's campaign. This is what's called the Porus coin, and it's a coin that shows Alexander attacking the Indian king Porus on his elephant. And the ancient accounts really celebrate the Battle of the Hydaspes because in Porus, Alexander finds a genuine rival. The story goes that Porus is fighting and fighting, his elephant's wounded, he's been wounded multiple times. Alexander sends a messenger to go and persuade him to surrender, and he kills the messenger, and then he sends another messenger and he drives him off, and then eventually Porus is forced to kind of surrender. And Alexander goes up to him and says, "How should I treat you?" And Porus says, "Like a king." And Alexander says, "What does that mean?" And he says, "Everything is contained in that request." And Alexander goes, "Oh, wow, this is a proper person. This is someone I can respect." And so instead of deposing him or anything like that, Alexander reinstates him as the ruler of the region that he was ruling and actually extends his territory. And the sources really celebrate this because Porus has behaved in a way that Darius III never did. Darius III, who fled from the battlefield twice. And this is quite an important moment because it's giving Alexander this kind of legendary status. So lots of people have focused on this moment. But in India as well, what we do see is mass slaughter as kind of tribes in India are systematically wiped out by Alexander and his men, sometimes because they refused to surrender, sometimes simply because they were there. The other thing about this is we see lots of local rivalry shaping the way that this campaign works. Usually when we think about a military invasion or we think about empires, we think about the conqueror and the conquered. And we lump the conquered all together. So what we do is we say, Alexander fought against the Indians. Yeah? But that's far too simplistic. When Alexander goes to India, he makes an alliance with a guy called Taxiles. Taxiles was already fighting a war with Porus. Somebody then tells Alexander, oh, this bloke Porus, he's definitely going to fight you. Who told him that? Do we think maybe it was Taxiles who wanted to get this useful conqueror on side to tackle his local rival, perhaps? And even if Taxiles didn't tell him anything, if Porus was determined to oppose his advance, is that because Porus is going, hang on, my enemy's got a new friend, so that's not looking good for me. And another thing that happened, so we're about to encounter the problem, which is everyone in Alexander's reign has the same name, right? So after the Battle of the Hydaspes, Porus is captured. News of Porus's capture escapes. It reaches a guy who I'm going to call Porus II, right? Porus II goes, oh, hang on, I don't like Porus I, I'm going to make an alliance with Alexander, sends off a missionary to make an alliance with Alexander. Great, going to be friends. Then he finds out that actually Alexander has reinstated and has praised Porus I, so then Porus II rebels. So now Alexander has to attack Porus II, but Porus II runs away, right? It's really easy for us to write a narrative through Alexander's eyes, which is going, oh, these Indians were just resisting. But actually, the motivation of these figures was absolutely affected not by what they thought of Alexander, but by what they thought of each other. And when Alexander's in India, if he had made a different alliance, if the first alliance he had made had been with a different person, there's a decent chance that this isn't called the Porus coin at all because he never fought Porus. That makes sense? That the local pre-existing rivalries and relationships really shaped the campaign in India. Alexander then returns back to the center of the empire. In Susa, he remarries again. He marries the daughters of the previous two Persian rulers. He also has his generals marry into the kind of Persian and Asian elite. At Opus, there's a military rebellion, a military kind of mutiny, which is then kind of put down quite viciously, and there's a banquet of reconciliation, which has led to lots of divergent opinions, but I'm going to skip over that because of time, and I want to come to just what happens next. So June 323, Alexander falls ill and he dies. He falls ill at a banquet because he got hammered, and very quickly people start to suggest he'd been poisoned, but there's no evidence for that really. But what we see with Alexander is immediately a contested legacy. His wife is pregnant but doesn't have a son. Eventually she gives birth to a son. He has a half-brother. They become co-kings. Neither of them is able to rule independently. His brother has some kind of mental illness, which means he can't take sole control. And his son's 3 weeks old, so not making decisions. So the generals kind of take over his empire, and within years are fighting with one another, and the Macedonian Empire falls apart. If Alexander's great political achievement is the creation of the greatest empire the ancient world had seen, it dies with him. And people have been fighting about Alexander's legacy ever since. And what's interesting, I think, about Alexander is he reaches almost every aspect of society. Yeah? This is actual William Shakespeare, right? Hamlet goes into a graveyard, contemplating what humanity means. And he looks in the ground and he says, do you think Alexander looked like this in the earth? As he's looking at the bones of a figure. And then he says, Alexander died. Alexander was buried. Alexander returned into dust. So as Hamlet is grappling with what it means to be human, Shakespeare calls on Alexander. Yeah? That's the sublime. To the ridiculous. When Alexander of Macedonia was 33, he cried salt tears because there were no more worlds to conquer. Eric Bristow's only 27. Sid Waddell talking about a darts player in the 1980s, right? But what that does, I think, is I think that makes us say, what should we do with Alexander now? Because historians are supposed to explain the past, right? My job is supposed to explain to you what happened. But what I've been trying to say today is I can't. Because with Alexander, we can't know. So what are we supposed to do? One of the things that I think historians should be better at is making it clear what we know and what we don't know. Rather than trying to contest facts which we can never prove, I think we should be letting debate take center stage. and give everybody a stake in that debate and the opportunity to choose their own interpretation of the past, to choose their own Alexander. I've tried to do a little bit of that tonight. I do a little bit more of it in the book. But one limitation of that, of course, is that if all I did was say, here are the sources, all historians would do the same thing. And at some point, you've got to take a stance on the things that matter. So to understand my Alexander and my interpretation of Alexander, we've got to go back to India. There's a great story. There's a battle going on against a city called the Malay. Alexander thinks that his troops aren't trying hard enough. So he runs to the front line, he grabs a ladder, he sticks it up against the wall, and he climbs up the ladder. Great leadership. So inspiring that so many of his men surge to follow him that all the ladders snap. And Alexander is left standing on the wall of the city. And he's got a choice. He can stand on the wall and be shot to pieces by the Indians who were firing down at him from towers or throwing up at him from in the city. He can jump to safety. There are his options. But of course, Alexandered. He jumped down into the city, backed himself up against a wall and started swinging. Of course he did. He's the descendant of Achilles. That's what he's supposed to do. Eventually, the Macedonians get in and kill everyone in the city. And Alexander, viciously wounded, nearly dies and he's carried away. But when we talk about Alexander, we talk about how Alexander's kind of been remembered. That episode encapsulates it. Alexander, Alexandering, careering around Asia, choosing the heroic option when it was available, manufacturing it when it wasn't. Whether we see this positively or negatively, the whole point of Alexander is that he Alexandered. But that is an illusion and a distraction. It's an image that tells us more about the people who've commentated on Alexander and their time than the man himself. So that's my Alexander. What's yours? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Stephen, for this fascinating talk. Now I'm happy to open the floor for questions. Oh, I see we have the first question here. Yes, please.
I know there's quite a lot of contention about sort of where Alexander ended up after he died. Where do you think he ended up? Because I know there's probably just as much literary debate on that as life. And I know they don't really know what the grave is, so what's your opinion?
Yeah. I mean, the whole talk could be about this. So, for people who don't know, Alexander dies 323 in Babylon. He is allegedly, he's meant to, Perdiccas, who becomes the general in charge, sort of creates this great funeral procession that's going to take Alexander's body back to Macedonia for burial. Great. Problem is, along the way, Ptolemy turns up with an army, steals the body, takes it back to Alexandria, buries it in Alexandria. And we know it's in Alexandria. They build a special building, the Soma, to house the body, and gradually over time it's lost. And now people have spent an awful lot of time trying to explain where it might be. Finding it is complicated by kind of changing sea levels in Alexandria, which have buried part of the ancient city. Also complicated by the fact that the modern city is over the top of it, so you can't do huge amounts of archaeological work. So in answer to your question, where do I think it is? I don't know. I think it's one of those questions where I'm not sure it matters. In that, I think there's sometimes with Alexander, we get so worried about the facts that I think we maybe lose sight of some of the other things we could be discussing. And I think that, if we find that tomb at some point, fantastic. It might give us some insight into how Ptolemy chose to represent Alexander or how Ptolemy chose to represent his relationship with Alexander. That's probably the limit of what it would tell us. So, yeah, it's a tricky one. It's one of those things where if you want to sell newspapers, you say, I found Alexander's tomb. Yeah? If you look at the blurb of the book, it says, a new theory about where Alexander's tomb is. My theory is, I can't tell you where his tomb is. I can tell you where it was supposed to be, which is, I think, one of the tombs. There were 3 tombs discovered in Macedonia. And scholars have debated who's in which tomb, whether Philip II is in one of them. There's a huge amount of debate about that. I think one of those tombs was supposed to be for Alexander, and he never got there. But yeah, I think that's as much as we can say right now, and I think hopefully people keep looking for it and find it. But yeah, it's a bit of a cop-out answer, isn't it? But, yeah.
One that I read that entertained me was somebody thinks that it got found and moved to Venice, and the bones of a saint are actually Alexander.
Yeah. But what I think, when I said I don't think it matters, what I mean by that is just in terms of like the historical knowledge we gain from it is quite limited for the kind of stuff people imagine would come from it. But that story you've just mentioned is brilliant because it shows you the way that Alexander speaks to so many different people and how so many different people want to take control of his legacy. And I think you could do a fantastic, people could do a fantastic book or a fantastic thesis about the kind of stories, the theories about Alexander's tomb and what that tells you about the way the world has changed and the contemporary world and the way we've looked back at it. So I think there's really interesting things we can do with it. But yeah.
So yes, we have a question from there. Yes.
Is it true, do you think it was true, that Alexander was a student under Aristotle?
Yes, I think that is true. I think that's true. Aristotle certainly has good connections to the Macedonian court and spent time in Macedonia. So that is something I would say true. I think the question is, how good a student was he? Because I think people have made an awful lot about this stuff. And we talk about the romantic traditions around Alexander. Some historians talk about, Alexander was motivated to go to India so that he could get plant cuttings and send them back for Aristotle to study. And I find that quite far-fetched. And I think, so when we say he was a student of Aristotle, how many classes did he have? What did he learn? All of those things. So yeah. But I do think that happened.
Gentleman in white shirt, yes, you can go. Yeah, please.
I was going to ask a question, but just on the Aristotle, if you get a chance to go to Macedonia, they think there is a class somewhere Aristotle taught Alexander and his companions, and it's definitely worth a visit. My question is a different one, which is Oliver Stone's film Alexander got hammered by the critics when it came out. It's undergone a bit of a reappraisal. Would you give it marks out of 10, please, and then why you give it marks out of 10?
The more you know about Alexander the Great, the better a film it is. The problem is, the film can never live up to the reality of it. The story's almost too good to be told in film, And I think part of what I've said today is that you've got so many different influences, so many different factors, and what people do when they create biographies is to try to boil all of the human condition down to one or two different factors. And I think in characterization in a film, that's inevitably what happens too. And then I think that that's just an oversimplification of history. What I like about Stone's film is, it's told through the perspective of Ptolemy. It tries to give you this sense of this being Ptolemy's view. It tries to play with some of those elements. So I think I haven't watched it for a while. I think when I have watched it, you can kind of, with quite a lot of it, I can watch it and go, all right, I know which source this is from. I can see what line they've taken there and things like that. And I think that's great, but then the tricky thing is you're picking one source and you're leaving out the other three. And so I think my way, I've been lucky enough to have some funding to do some short films about Alexander. They're on YouTube. They're only 10 minutes long. And what I want to do is to bring out the debate. And I think I say it in the book. There was a Netflix docudrama series last year, and my problem with that was it was entirely didactic. You were basically told this is the true story of what happened to Alexander, and actually I'd much rather say to an audience you've got Netflix, you've got the computer, play it through in a few different ways if you want to. Have a scene, watch the scene. If you want to say, actually I think Alexander was a drunkard, as one biographer does, play the scene through again with Alexander being a drunkard. How does it look? Actually, I'd rather see Alexander as a magnanimous figure. Play it again, And I just think, as we communicate the past, I think, it's what I say, Alexander would try to communicate facts, and actually facts are the least interesting thing about Alexander. The interesting thing is debate.
Did you give it marks out of 10?
Oh, director's cut or... all right. I'll tell you, rather than giving it out of 10, I'd say I have bought it, I own it, and I tell my students to watch.
When he was in India, he wanted to continue further east, but his troops persuaded him to go back. So was that a mutiny, or did he agree to it?
Yeah. Okay, so the question is, why did Alexander turn around in India, essentially? So, yeah, allegedly what happens is they get to the banks of the river Hyphasis, and Alexander says, right, we're going to cross the Hyphasis. There are more warlike tribes over there, we can keep going, there's more riches, and the story is that there's grumblings in the camp, and gradually people are starting to drag their feet and they don't want to go. It's monsoon season in India as well, which doesn't help morale. And apparently Alexander calls a meeting or an assembly of his men to try to persuade them to cross the river, and he gives this big impassioned speech where he's like, come on lads, let's get at him, come on, let's go. And he finishes and there's just silence. There's no cheering and there's silence. And then a guy called Coinus kind of stands up and says, look, here's where we're at. We've had a good time, we've done well, you should carry on campaigning, but it needs to be in the future with younger men. Let us go home and enjoy the fruits of our labour. And Alexander basically says, goes back to his tent, and then he orders the sacrifices to cross the river. So Greeks would normally sacrifice before you cross the river for kind of the support of the gods. And then the sacrifices are not positive. And so he says, oh, we'll go home, we'll go home. And I think you can read that in lots of different ways. On the one hand, you can say, all right, Alexander doesn't want to admit he's turned around because his men have asked him to. He said, let's go. And it's based on the gods. It's not willed by the gods. So you can read it like that. Alternatively, another way of saying it would be that actually all these rumours about the great tribes of India and all the riches and about how warlike they were, where did they come from? And a cynic might look at it and say, is Alexander having this put about the camp so that when he turns round, he's been foiled by his men rather than having chosen to turn back before he hits the borders of the world? So you could read it that way as well. I think mutiny, I probably wouldn't call it, to answer the question directly, I wouldn't call it a mutiny, but I probably would say this is him finding that he can't force his men to go where they don't want to go.
Yeah, we have the question here. This third row, please. First, yes, and then a lady in green after that.
Hello. Can I just ask if you came across any other books when you were doing your research on this that were similar to yours in approach in terms of this aspect of representations of Alexander and, his whatever?
No, absolutely not. My book's entirely unique and nothing like it has ever been done before. The thing is, I think, my book's a biography, and there's lots of biographies of Alexander, and essentially the story that we all tell is similar. We're picking on the same kind of key moments.
Yeah, I'm just wondering in particular about this truth, this theoretical perspective of trying to tell the truth about Alexander. How many books and for how many decades have people been sort of dealing with the representation in the way that you do?
So I think people have always acknowledged the challenges of actually finding out what happened. People have always acknowledged it. I think what I've done and what I've tried to do is reflect on that a little bit more and taken the leap towards saying, what does this mean for us as historians when we can't get to this? And I think the book is a book about Alexander the Great. And I'm going to say it in the introduction. It's a book about Alexander the Great, but it's also a book about how and why historians do history, and therefore it makes it a bit of a book about me. And there are bits in there where I kind of reflect on things. So, for example, I didn't talk about it today, but there's a passage in the book where Alexander besieges Gaza, and I was writing the book last January while the news reports were coming through from Gaza, and I went back and I saw a passage, and in the text I had written, and I vividly remember realising this, I'd written, the inhabitants of Gaza were hacked to pieces in their tens of thousands. And I read it and I thought, first of all, that's a little bit the kind of exaggerated style that I kind of critiqued earlier. But I also kind of went back and I checked the sources. And the sources don't say tens of thousands were killed. There's one source says 10,000, but it's hard to know how seriously to take that. And then nothing says kind of hacked to pieces. Now, of course, the Macedonians were going through with spears and things, so hacked to pieces is a fair account of it. But I think what I realised was just unconsciously, the sort of things that you see around you, the things that I was seeing in the news were affecting the way that I was writing. And so I kind of commented on that a little bit.
Reflect on your reflections that come out unconsciously, if you see what I mean. Do you give us a framework to do that, or are you just hoping?
So I don't kind of give a theoretical framework, but what I'm trying to do, and there's quite a few places in the book where I give examples of different historians. I kind of skipped over it today, but there's a banquet at Opus where one person thinks that it's kind of Alexander trying to create universal peace, and one person thinking that it's the complete opposite of that, and they're two people who have very different backgrounds. And so I'm trying to kind of get us to reflect on how we see the past and how the influences of our own lives affect not just our interpretations, but the questions that we ask and what we think are important. So I don't give a kind of theoretical framework for it as such, because I think it's not the kind of book where that quite works, but I think there's examples in it where I'm kind of encouraging us to. Yeah.
The last question, very brief one, please, lady in green.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
You've spent 20 years of your life, you said, on Alexander. You've written the unique book. You've now put Alexander out for your audiences to form their own opinions and decide which Alexander they want. Where do you go next in your life, in your career, in your researches?
That's a really nice question, and partly the answer is I don't know. And it's because I think this book kind of happened a little bit by surprise. I didn't kind of set out to write this book. I got asked to write it, and I kind of at a point where I'd been studying Alexander a lot, and I was teaching Alexander, and I really kind of wanted to do this and to write for a different audience. But also I've been working on a kind of more academic book, which literally no one will read. But that's out this year as well, and it kind of means I'm coming to the end of big projects. So what I've got to do is think a little bit about what I want to do next and what I want the big project to be. One of the ideas I've got is I'm interested in kind of Alexander's later reception, and particularly kind of how Alexander was perceived by people who were engaged in imperial activity themselves. So with the East India Company, going out into India, treading over territory that Alexander had been associated with. I'm interested in that. But yeah, part of it is just I've got to sit down and think a little bit about... It's an exciting point, because what I can do is just sit down and say, like, what do I think is worth investigating? And I think like this book, and I don't know, if people are going through this, like, research careers are really surprising. I don't know if you think this, like with your career, that in 2008, I wrote an essay on Alexander, and I quite liked writing it. So in 2009, I did my undergrad dissertation on Alexander. Bit random, but I did. It wasn't that I liked Alexander any more than any other period of history. I was doing a history degree, and then once I'd asked one question, I started asking another question, and it snowballed into kind of lots of different kind of publications. So yeah, I just need to think about it a bit. Is the plan. What I'm not doing is writing anything else for a year. I'm having a bit of a breather to kind of let it rest.
Yeah, thank you very much, Stephen, again, for this thought-provoking talk. I especially enjoyed your section on Alexander's activities in Sogdiana and Bactria, because I am from this part of the world. Thank you again for bringing Alexander's world to life today. Yes, for those interested, Stephen's book is available to purchase from our independent bookseller, Fox Lane Books, and Stephen will be also happy to sign copies after the session. Thank you again for joining us today, and also please check what else can